Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And what can I say? Mr. Darcy has proposed, and Elizabeth has accepted him this time. so, uh, all that's left, one of the big things that's left, is for our hero, Lizzie, to tell her family, who are under the impression that not only is he the most disagreeable man in the world, but that she doesn't like him, that she thinks he's obnoxious. So that's not going to be an easy task. The two have poured out their hearts to each other, out on a walk. Then they come back to Longbourn and are trapped in silence. They can't make an announcement to anybody. So this is chapter 59. "My dear Lizzie, where can you have been walking to?" was a question which Elizabeth received from Jane as soon as she entered the room, and from all the others when they sat down to table. She had only to say in reply that they had wandered about till she was beyond her own knowledge. She colored as she spoke, but neither that nor anything else awakened a suspicion of the truth, because it's the last thing in the world anybody's looking for. The evening passed quietly, unmarked by anything extraordinary. The acknowledged lovers talked and laughed, that is, Jane and Bingley. The unacknowledged were silent. Darcy was not of a disposition in which happiness overflows in mirth, and Elizabeth, agitated and confused, rather knew she was happy than felt herself to be so. For, besides the immediate embarrassment, there were other evils before her. She anticipated what would be felt in the family when her situation became known. She was aware that no one liked him but Jane, and even feared that with the others it was dislike, which not all his fortune and consequence might do away. At night she opened her heart to Jane. Though suspicion was very far from Miss Bennet's general habits, she was absolutely incredulous here. "You are joking, Lizzie. This cannot be. Engaged to Mr. Darcy. No, no, you shall not deceive me. I know it to be impossible." "This is a wretched beginning, indeed." This is Elizabeth's reply, and keep in mind, she's getting, in return from what she's saying, exactly what she gave to Charlotte Lucas. Only in her case it was justified, and in this case, no. "This is a wretched beginning indeed. My sole dependence was on you, and I am sure that nobody else will believe me if you do not. Yet, indeed, I am in earnest. I speak nothing but the truth. He still loves me, and we are engaged." Jane looked at her doubtingly. "Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. I know how much you dislike him." "You know nothing of the matter. That is all to be forgot. Perhaps I did not always love him so well as I do now, but in such cases as these a good memory is unpardonable. This is the last time I shall ever remember it myself." Miss Bennet still looked all amazement. Elizabeth again and more seriously assured her of its truth. "Good heaven, it can't really be so. Yet now I must believe you," cried Jane. "My dear, dear Lizzie, I do congratulate you, but are you certain? Forgive the question, are you quite certain that you can be happy with him?" "There can be no doubt of that. It is settled between us already, and we are to be the happiest couple in the world. But are you pleased, Jane? Shall I not like to have such a brother?" "Very, very much. Nothing could give either Bingley or myself more delight. But we have considered it, we have talked about it as impossible." "And do you really love him quite well enough? Oh, Lizzie, do anything rather than marry without affection." "Are you quite sure that you feel what you ought to feel?" "Oh, yes." "You will only think I feel more than I ought to do when I tell you all." "What do you mean?" "Why, I must confess that I love him better than I do Bingley, and I am afraid you will be angry." "My dearest sister, now be serious. I want to talk very seriously. Let me know everything that I am to know, without delay. Will you tell me how long you have loved him?" "It has been coming on so gradually that I hardly know when it began, but I believe it must date to first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley." Even in the midst of this outpouring of heartfelt sincerity, Elizabeth can't help teasing her sister. Another entreaty that she should be serious, however, produced the desired effect, and she soon satisfied Jane by her solemn assurances of attachment. When convinced on that article, Miss Bennet had nothing further to wish. "Now I am quite happy," said she, "for you will be as happy as myself. I always had a value for him. Were it nothing but his love of you, I must always have esteemed him, but now, as Bingley's friend and your husband, there can only be Bingley and yourself more dear to me. But, Lizzie, you have been very sly, very reserved with me. How little did you tell me of what passed at Pemberley or Lambton?" I owe all of that I know of it to another, not to you." Elizabeth told her the motives of her secrecy. She had been unwilling to mention Bingley. An unsettled state of her own feelings had made her equally avoid the name of his friend. But now she would no longer conceal from her his share in Lydia's marriage. All was acknowledged, and half the night spent in conversation. "Good gracious," cried Mrs. Bennet, when she stood at the window the next morning, "if that disagreeable Mr. Darcy is not coming here again with our dear Bingley! What can he mean by being so tiresome as to be always coming here? Had I no notion but that he would go on a shooting or something or other, and not disturb us with his company? What shall we do with him? Lizzie, you must walk out with him again, that he may not be in Bingley's way." I know I started this whole reading event by defending Mrs. Bennet, and I have been trying at every turn to defend her. I do not understand why she doesn't put two and two together here. Not out of a sense of love or even a knowledge of her daughter, but out of sheer opportunism. Why doesn't anybody put these two together? Why would Darcy keep coming and ending up alone with Elizabeth? He's always alone with her. Anyway, Elizabeth could hardly help laughing at so convenient a proposal, yet was really vexed that her mother should always be giving him such an epithet. As soon as they entered, Bingley looked at her so expressively and shook hands with such warmth as left no doubt of his good information, and he soon afterwards said aloud, "Mr. Bennet, have you no more lanes hereabout in which Lizzie may lose her way again today?" "I advise Mr. Darcy and Lizzie and Kitty," said Mrs. Bennet, "to walk to Oakham Mount this morning. It is a nice long walk, and Mr. Darcy has never seen the view." "It may do very well for the others," replied Mr. Bingley, "but I am sure it will be too much for Kitty, won't it?" Kitty. Kitty owned that she had rather stay at home. Darcy professed a great curiosity to see the view from the mount, and Elizabeth silently consented. As she went upstairs to get ready, Mrs. Bennet followed her, saying, I'm quite sorry, Lizzie, that you should be forced to have that disagreeable man all to yourself, but I hope you will not mind. It is all for Jane's sake, you know, and there is no occasion for talking to him, except just now and then, so do not put yourself to inconvenience." That is a nice thing for Mrs. Bennet to do. She's not thinking of anyone but Jane, and yet she takes a minute to think that it might be tedious for Elizabeth to walk out with this man she doesn't like. During their walk, it was resolved that Mr. Bennet's consent should be asked in the course of the evening. Elizabeth reserved to herself the application for her mother's. She could not determine how her mother would take it, sometimes doubting whether all his wealth and grandeur would be enough to overcome her abhorrence of the man. But whether she were violently set against the match or violently delighted with it, it was certain that her manner would be equally ill-adapted to do credit to her sense, and she could no more bear that Mr. Darcy should hear the first raptures of her joy than the first vehemence of her disapprobation. Elizabeth is fairly certain that her mother will embarrass her either way, so she wants to get it done in private in her mother's room. In the evening, soon after Mr. Bennet withdrew to the library, she saw Mr. Darcy rise also and follow him, and her agitation on seeing it was extreme. She did not fear her father's opposition, but he was going to be made unhappy, and it should be through her means that she, his favourite child, should be distressing him by her choice, should be filling him with fears and regrets of disposing of her, was a wretched reflection, and she sat in misery till Mr. Darcy appeared again, when, looking at him, she saw she was a little relieved by his smile. In a few minutes he approached the table where she was sitting with Kitty, and while pretending to admire her work, said in a whisper, "Go to your father. He wants you in the library." She was gone directly. Her father was walking about the room, looking grave and anxious. "Lizzie," said he, "what are you doing? Are you out of your senses to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?" How earnestly did she then wish that her former opinions had been more reasonable, her expressions more moderate. It would have spared her from the explanations and professions which it was exceedingly awkward to give. But they were now necessary, for she assured him with some confusion of her attachment to Mr. Darcy. "In other words, you are determined to have him. He is rich, to be sure, and you may have more fine clothes and fine carriages than Jane, but will they make you happy?" "Have you any other objection," said Elizabeth, "than your belief to my indifference?" "None at all. We all know him to be proud, unpleasant sort of man, but this would be nothing if you really liked him." Surely she is above suspicion, but then again, Mr. Bennet might be remembering that she was quite infatuated with Wickham, and that maybe she doesn't see as far in matters of love as she does in all other matters. I do like him," she replied with tears in her eyes. "I love him." Indeed, he has no improper pride. He is perfectly amiable. You do not know what he really is. Then pray do not pain me by speaking of him in such terms. Lizzie, said her father, I have given him my consent. He is the kind of man, indeed, to whom I should never dare refuse anything, which he condescended to ask. I now give it to you, if you are resolved on having it. But let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. And then Mr. Bennet speaks one of the truest, most from-the-heart lines that he ever talks in this book. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. That's Mr. Bennet talking about himself. That's heartfelt. You know not what you are about. Elizabeth, still more affected, was earnest and solemn in her reply, and at length, by repeated assurances that Mr. Darcy was really the object of her choice, by explaining the gradual change which her estimation of him had undergone, relating her absolute certainty that his affection was not the work of a day, but had stood the test of many months' suspense, and enumerating with energy all his good qualities, she did conquer her father's incredulity, and reconcile him to the match. Well, my dear, said he, when she ceased speaking, I have no more to say. If this be the case, he deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy. She hasn't told him everything. To complete the favorable impression, she then told him what Mr. Darcy had voluntarily done for Lydia. He heard her with astonishment. This is an evening of wonders, indeed. And so Darcy did everything, made up the match, gave the money, paid the fellow's debts, and got him his commission. So much the better. It will save me a world of trouble and economy. Had it been your uncle's doing, I must and would have paid him, but these violent young lovers carry everything their own way. I shall offer to pay him tomorrow. He will rant and storm about his love for you, and there will be the end of the matter. Mr. Bennet has resorted immediately to joking. That he would have been in debt if it had been his brother-in-law that had to do the spending for Lydia, but if Darcy did it, then he's free from that debt. He then recollected her embarrassment a few days before on his reading Mr. Collins's letter, and after laughing at her some time, allowed her at last to go, saying as she quitted the room, If any young men come from Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite at leisure. Like it's just a stream of suitors and they don't mean anything. It's just one after another. I don't really care if you're in love. This is all just a very amusing evening. I do not like this guy. I really don't. I know people go on and on about the monster, the Gorgon that Mrs. Bennet is, but he's a terrible parent. Terrible. And it gets worse in this chapter. Elizabeth's mind was now relieved from a heavy weight, and after a half an hour's quiet reflection in her own room, she was able to join the others with tolerable composure. Everything was too recent for gaiety, but the evening passed tranquilly away. There was no longer any material to be dreaded, and the comfort of ease and familiarity would come in time. When her mother went up to her dressing room at night, she followed her and made the important communication. Its effect was most extraordinary, for on first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still, unable to utter a syllable. Mrs. Bennet just sits there, staring in silence. You could practically hear the cogs and wheels turning extra fast in her brain. What does this mean? But she will soon settle on the only meaning that matters to her. Nor was it under many, many minutes that she could comprehend what she heard. Though not in general backward to credit what was for the advantage of her family, or that came in the shape of a lover to any of them, she began at length to recover, to fidget about in her chair, get up, sit down again, wonder, and bless herself. Good gracious! Lord bless me! Only think, my dear me! Mr. Darcy! Who would have thought it? And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich, how great you will be! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have! Jane's is nothing to it, nothing at all. I am so pleased, so happy, such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, pray apologize for my having disliked him so much before. I hope he will overlook it. Dear, dear Lizzie, a house in town, everything that is charming, 3 daughters married, 10,000 a year. Oh, Lord, what will become of me? I shall go distracted. There was enough to prove that her approbation did not need to be doubted, and Elizabeth, rejoicing at such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. But before she had been 3 minutes in her own room, her mother followed her. "My dearest child," she cried, "I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord. And a special license. You must and shall be married by a special license. But, my dear love, tell me what dish Mr. Darcy is particularly fond of, that I may have it tomorrow." I know. She's going on and on about money and carriages. But you don't get to pick your parents. And that is a wonderful, homely, "oh, ma, don't ever change" note. That having heard that Elizabeth is going to be the next best thing to a lord's wife, she wants to know, well, what can I get for him to give him for food tomorrow? This was a sad omen of what her mother's behavior to the gentleman himself might be. I don't see why. It's just our narrator is still ashamed of Mrs. Bennet, still too harsh on her. All this time later, 50 chapters later. And Elizabeth found that though in certain possession of his warmest affection and secure in his relations' consent, there was still something to be wished for. But the morrow passed off much better than she expected, for Mrs. Bennet luckily stood in such awe of her intended son-in-law that she ventured not to speak to him, unless it was in her power to offer him any attention or mark her deference for his opinion. Elizabeth had the satisfaction of seeing her father taking pains to get acquainted with him, and Mr. Bennet soon assured her that he was rising every hour in his esteem, and this is what he has to say on the subject. "I admire all my 3 sons-in-law highly," said he. "Wickham, perhaps, is my favorite, but I think I shall like your husband quite as well as Jane's." So again, all he cares about is it funny? Can I mock it? That's all he cares about. Anyway, Wickham is the man who almost brought his youngest girl to shame and ruin in the whole community. Doesn't matter. And he was saved by other people, because he has never in his life put 2 pennies aside for savings. So he was saved by other people and was worried that he would have to pay Mr. Gardiner back for an expenditure of at least £5,000. And how was he going to do that on his miserable income? But now that Darcy's paid it, well, I'm lucky, I'm off the hook. And another one of my silly little girls has got married, and all of the husbands are equally ridiculous, so I get to laugh at them all. Wickham favorite of all. But I don't want to turn the happy occasion into a rant. That is the scene where Elizabeth lets everybody know. Darcy and Elizabeth tell the family. We already know the reaction of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Now we know their reaction as well. Let's see what more. This is classic falling action. This is classic wrapping things up. Let's see what happens next time, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.